Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today, on this day after the holiday edition of Squawk Pod. A landslide Labour Party win in the United Kingdom. Former CNBCer and Sky News anchor Wilfred Frost explains.
What this means is that Keir Starmer is perhaps the most powerful Prime Minister since Tony Blair in 1997.
And stateside, the Democratic debate wears on, unpacking the president's ego and Dem voter loyalty with author Adam Grant.
The writing seems to be on the wall. There's an open question about whether voters will change their mind.
And Boeing's missteps coming to a head. Former United CEO Oscar Munoz on whether the company should go to trial.
Even going the plea deal route is not an easy one.
Those stories today, plus it's the first Friday of the month. What America's jobs say about the Fed's next decision. It is Friday, July 5th. Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Andrew by in 3, 2, 1. Cue Andrew.
Good morning and welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live at the NASDAQ Market Set in Times Square. I'm Andrew Ross Sorkin along with Joe Kernan. Becky is off. Hope everybody had a good July 4th, Independence Day. We're about to talk to somebody who probably doesn't love Independence Day as much. Maybe he does.
He does.
It's a different type of Independence Day, by the way, which they just had in the UK.
I will shortly be seeing His Majesty the King to offer my resignation as Prime Minister. To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters.
Let's talk about what just happened in the UK. The UK's opposition Labour Party winning a huge parliamentary majority in the country's general election, unseating the incumbent Conservatives after 14 years. And just hours ago, outgoing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak conceding defeat after less than 2 years in office, apologizing to his party for the scale of the loss. Keir Starmer, leader of the centre-left Labour, will now become the country's next Prime Minister. Take a look.
Now we can look forward again, walk into the morning, the sunlight of hope, pale at first, but getting stronger through the day, shining once again on a country with the opportunity after 14 years to get its future back.
Okay, joining us right now, Sky News anchor, MSNBC, CNBC news contributor, and one of our own is back in town.
It's great to be here, guys.
Wilfred Frost is
great
here.
to be around the desk.
Okay, so tell us
Happy
what this...
Fourth to you guys, by
Thank
the way,
you.
as well.
Back as a father.
Back as a father, too. So tell us what this all means.
So, by the way, firstly, that picture we just showed of Sunak offering his resignation was sort of moments ago, and he's now seeing the King. He'll offer his resignation. The King will then invite Starmer to form a government. So we'll see Starmer return to Downing Street in the next hour or so as Prime Minister. What this means is that Keir Starmer is perhaps the most powerful Prime Minister since Tony Blair in 1997. He's got a massive majority. He can do what he wants, of course. Over there in the UK, the executive is drawn from the legislature and he's got a huge majority in it. So basically what he wants to pass will happen. And that's off actually quite a small percentage of the vote. He's got over 60% of the seats from just 34% of the vote. And the lesson from this really is much more of an implosion of the Conservative Party necessarily than a Labour Party victory. But to give Starmer and the Labour Party credit, they read the tea leaves over the last couple of years and thus played things very, very safe. Didn't want to rock the boat, and it's worked.
Tony Blair had an actual bigger majority than this.
Well, neck and neck, actually, as things go.
Yeah, some not quite as many, 4 or less or something like that.
Some had predicted a bigger win for Labour than this, but this is a huge victory. There's no question about that. The big story of the night. From a policy
perspective, how's it going to change Britain? But maybe you can also just suggest what's going to happen in all of Europe, because we're also watching what's happening in France.
Yeah. So on the policy perspective, firstly, because they knew that the Tories were unpopular and therefore they could play it safe, they didn't want to differ too much in terms of the manifesto. Also, because there's not much money to spend, finances are tight. So fiscally, their manifestos weren't that different at the margin. They want to increase taxes on private school education, for example, but they ruled out increasing income tax. So there's not a massive difference on some of those minor policy fronts. I interviewed Jamie Dimon in London a few weeks ago, and he just met with both leaders. And the headline from that, he said, both of them are pro-business. So again, that's worth reading. He's perhaps not as centrist as Tony Blair, but only marginally to the left. He's certainly not like Jeremy Corbyn, who's obviously the sort of Bernie Sanders characters of British politics. The really interesting perspective for business is twofold. One, they've got 5 years of certainty ahead of them with someone that's broadly at least pro-business, whereas in the last 3 or 4 years, with such a big majority, but there's no threats to his party within his leadership, whereas we kept changing leader in the last couple of years. There's also the possibility to take the UK a bit closer to the EU again. The renegotiation is next year. Right. It comes early in his parliament, so he doesn't have to worry about facing an election immediately after it and what that might do. And he's not going to take the UK back into the EU, but he might make the trade relations a bit tighter.
That has been broached, though, the possibility of rejoining, right?
I don't think anyone would reopen it, but because you risk the electoral defeat of doing so, and by playing it safe this time around.
I've just seen some rhetoric, people that want to go back and saying it's possible. Wilf made the point that if you add reform together with the Tories, they're still much more.
Not in seats, in the percentage of the vote, and this is one of the nuances of our system. And you've never had, by the way, a bigger discrepancy between the percentage of seats and the percentage of the votes that Labour just won. So that's going to lead to Farage and Reform.
He's an MP.
Only getting 4 seats, but they got 14% of the vote. The Tories got 24% of the vote, that's more than Labour's 34%. In terms of the comparisons with France, clearly Le Pen got 33% of the vote, and we don't know if she's going to get a majority or not over the weekend, but she'll get at least 40% of the seats. So in that sense, the work that Marine Le Pen and the far right have gone, or the right, whatever you want to call it, have gone through in France, which has taken decades, way ahead of where Nigel Farage is. I think the other thing you'd say is, in 2019, Boris Johnson united the right in the UK under the banner of the Conservatives. Rishi Sunak has split the right. And that is perhaps the most devastating factor in terms of this result. The other thing I'd just say between the French elections and the UK elections, the similarity is twofold. Both have had leaders who didn't have to go to the polls yet. They took a gamble that has backfired monumentally. They could have waited longer. And both incumbents have been smashed. Interestingly, in France, the beneficiary is more the far right, but actually it's also the far left. Macron came third. And the story there is actually the incumbent being smashed. And that's the same, even though it's the Tories in the UK that are being smashed, it's the incumbent that's been hit hard. A lot of factors at play there. The Tories have been in power for 14 years. The pendulum swings back at some point. I think the interesting business similarity is inflation. Inflation is kryptonite for whoever's in power. And the difference you have here in the US is at least the rest of the economy has been going well. And it offsets the damage that inflation does, at least partially.
I was struck that you said both the Conservatives and Labour are both pro-business, generally. That's not the same. It's not what we think of it, pro-Euro business or pro-UK business. I think that's a little different, isn't it?
I throw back to my first times coming on with you, Joe, in 2016.
It's the left
are we all socialists in Europe?
Exactly. Well, not the UK so much. Trending, but
again, look at the snapshot that we just had, which is 5 years ago, the choice, or 4.5 years ago, the choice was Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Corbyn. And Jeremy Corbyn was, again, these labels get thrown around, but he was basically far left. He was much more aggressive in his manifesto and taxes and things like that. Keir Starmer has realised, really, to win elections and to govern in the UK, you've got to tack to the centre, and he's done that. Rachel Reeves expected to be announced as the first female Chancellor of the Exchequer. We've had female prime ministers, of course, but the first female finance minister today. He gets to pick his cabinet, so we don't know for sure what it is, but almost certain she'll be the finance minister. She's very clearly pro-business.
How about France? Is that going to become more pro-business in France, or would you call Macron pro-business?
Well, I think Macron has been pro-business.
He's pro-business on a relative basis to what?
We always have to say on a relative basis.
No, but if you point to the single biggest thing that's annoyed voters in France, it's his pension reforms. And it's not just the reforms themselves, which we'd all look at as pro-business reforms because you've got an aging population. You have to lift it a little bit because it's kind of extreme otherwise. But that backfired. But he also forced it through against the wishes of Parliament, which the president in France has some powers to do. He lost a parliamentary vote and then forced it through. So it kind of all came into one to sort of display to people that they'd had enough with Macron.
I'm just glad I actually heard you say the words far left for Corbyn, because that's usually all we hear is far right. That's all here. We don't. There's nobody who's far left. It's just you're either normal or far right.
Well, yeah, I think he's been kicked out of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer came in, and that was perhaps the most high-profile way Starmer showed that he was trying to move things back. He's no longer in. And by the way, though, Jeremy Corbyn did win his seat as an independent, which people didn't really expect. So he's kind of still got this personal appeal. Just on that, though, in terms of what things mean here, it's worth mentioning that his position on Israel-Gaza, Keir Starmer, similar problem to as the left and the Democrats have had here with Biden. He lost 4 or 5 seats where there was a very high percentage of Muslim votes. So he did actually lose some seats to the left. I mean, be lost in the wash when you win 412 of 650 seats, but there's some nuances to it.
Let's get to today's other big headline, the Labor Department's monthly jobs report.
June jobs report. Non-farm payrolls expands 206,000.
Unexpectedly, the unemployment rate ticked up from 4% to 4.1%. That's the highest since October of 2021. This report comes as the Federal Reserve weighs the timing of its first rate cut since it began hiking interest rates in 2022. Now, we're all expecting one rate cut in 2024, but economists are pretty split on whether it happens before or after the November election. Today's report of a boost in jobs, but an uptick in unemployment, well, it further complicates the road ahead.
Cheese will be next.
Coming up on Squawk Pod, the ego and emotion at play in the White House. Author Adam Grant on the post-debate debate about President Biden's decision to stay in the 2024 race.
So we've heard President Biden talk about how he's a fighter. He doesn't want to feel or look like a quitter. That's potentially the wrong frame for this decision.
This is Squawk Pod.
Up and Andrew, Q.
You're watching Squawk Box on CNBC. Happy July 4th if you're just waking up with us after some firecrackers and other things last night. I'm Andrew Ross Sorkin, along with Joe Kernan. Becky is off today. We might have our own firecrackers.
Pressure mounting on President Biden to step aside, and he's losing more wealthy donors. Megan Cassella joins us now with more. Good morning, Megan.
Good morning, Joe. So the drip nature of this story continues. A small but now growing number of major Democratic donors are publicly calling on Biden to step aside. You guys mentioned a couple of these names just now, but Netflix co-founder Reed Hastings was one of the first. He posted a link yesterday to an article from The Economist on why Biden must resign. Abigail Disney told CNBC yesterday she would be withholding all donations to the Democratic Party until Biden drops out. And the screenwriter Damon Lindelof, he wrote an essay for Deadline calling for a Dembargo. No checks written to any Democrats until there's a change at the top of the ticket. It's not unanimous. Some of the donors and fundraisers I'm in touch with say they see things as mostly in a holding pattern while they're sort of holding their breath to see how Biden's interview goes with ABC News later today. And Dimitri Melhorn, he's Reid Hoffman's donor advisor, he sent an 8-part email last night urging Democrats to see why Biden, in his view, is the one to beat Trump. The Biden campaign is also pushing to reset the narrative. They're launching a $50 million ad buy for July and pledging to make Biden available for more interviews, including some off-the-cuff remarks. But guys, it's very unclear at this point whether he'll be able to recover that support. Joe?
Well, we'll see. It does matter tonight, and it's going to be live, and the unedited version of the interview is going to be released. So it's no longer, George Stephanopoulos taping it and, people saying, oh, well, this might have been cut and this might have been cut. Now it's going to be live. So we'll see. And the president could do well.
Right.
You don't, watching him recently, and everybody's going to I knew exactly what he was saying, Andrew. I mean, in fairness, when he said, it used to be there'd be so much traffic in Washington. We close down roads, and they do when the president leaves. And he says, so, I got to go because we're not going to leave the roads closed down for like a half hour while I'm answering questions.
Just one question, and maybe for Megan, maybe you know it better than I do. Is the interview, I know the interview obviously is airing this evening. Right. Is the interview unto itself live?
No, I don't think so. Right, Megan? They're going to do it, and then they're going to run it at,
it's not going to be live. It's not a live interview.
The 15 minutes or whatever it is, I'm not sure Megan, it might not be exactly 15 minutes. That's what they are promised ABC. But however long it is, they're going to run it at 8.
That's right. An 8 p.m. primetime special. I wouldn't be surprised if it runs longer than 15 minutes.
Yeah,
it won't
too.
be live. My understanding is they're taping it just after his Wisconsin campaign event today. I would say you can't underestimate just how important this is going to be for the president.
Right. Yeah, they're not going to do it at 8.
No, that was what I was saying. When you said they're going to do it live, I was saying to myself, I don't remember it being live.
Well, because he's not going to go past 8, especially on a Friday night. I mean, he'll be sawing logs by 8:15, right? From what we heard, and people took all that bad. A lot of it was tongue in cheek. I don't have ulterior motives because I don't think Kamala would be a great candidate. This is the state of where we are right now. Neither one is great, but the treatment of the president by the people that used to love him so much, I just find a little bit. I don't know. I watching these people so quickly change, like Reed Hayes, Abigail Disney. I would, for a living, I do the opposite of what.
I don't understand why you think that at all.
I think that all these people were so loyal and all. No, what's my ulterior motive?
I'm not even sure. I can't do the 3D chess that you're playing, but there's some chess that you're playing that I don't know about.
You know what? It's really cynical.
Yes, it is.
You.
It is
very cynical.
It gotta be.
Thanks,
gotta
Megan.
be.
Meantime,
President Biden has fallen into a trap following what was widely perceived as a disastrous debate performance last week. That's according to Wharton School professor Adam Grant. He says it's an escalation of commitment to a losing course of action. He wrote about it in a new op-ed in the New York Times. And joining us right now to explain is Professor Adam Grant. He's the author, of course, of Think Again, and a longtime friend of the Squawk program. Adam, it's great to see you. I read your piece, from top to bottom with great fascination. Before we even get into the dynamics at play with which you describe, I'm curious just how you thought about even writing that down on paper, because I think there's been a lot of folks who haven't wanted to say what you said.
Well, I think that there's no value in staying quiet in a moment like this, right? I think there is such a thing as strategic silence and waiting for the right moment. But a lot of people have been waiting over a year to raise the question of, should the president rethink this decision to run? And I think after the debate performance, just felt like it was time to speak up.
And just to put one fine point on that before we get into some of the organizational psychology issues you describe, the president is going to be on television this evening with George Stephanopoulos. Is there anything you believe he could say which would change your mind?
Well, I don't have a clear view of, should he walk away immediately? Should he, stay in the race? Should he wait another few days? I think that, though, the writing seems to be on the wall. And I think at this point, even if, he's able to demonstrate a lot of vigor and cognitive clarity, there's an open question about whether voters will change their mind. And I think that's a question that needs to be weighed a lot more seriously than it has been so far.
Adam, if you knew now, if I could tell you that Kamala Harris would be the nominee in spite of Joe Biden, and that she would lose as well to Donald Trump, would that change your mind on whether President Biden should go?
I don't know. I think it's really hard to say at this point, right? It's July. We're trying to forecast November. That's a difficult task.
No, but this is really about Trump, though, right? I mean, this is really about Trump. I mean, you think Biden's going to lose to Trump, so you would run a potted plan if you could, if you thought that they could beat Trump. This is all about the bad orange man for you, is it not?
I wouldn't have phrased it that way, Joe. But look, I think that there are a lot of people who are worried about the state of democracy, and so I think the big question for the Democrats
except at the Washington Post, they're more worried about the state of democracy under Biden than under Trump. You saw that piece, I guess.
Yeah, I did. But look, I think the question here for Democrats is who's the best candidate to defeat Donald Trump? And I think so far, what I'm seeing from President Biden's advisors is they're more trying to focus on the question of, should he run or should he not run, as opposed to asking, if we're really concerned that democracy is on the line, who is the best person to save it?
Adam, speak to this. In the piece, you talk about what you call this trap, the escalation of commitment to a losing course of action. And you say that's a formal name or a technical name. Walk us through that thinking. Also, walk us through that thinking in terms of the team that's around him, and to the degree you think their credibility is in question, if they pursue this path, what happens later if, in fact, they have to switch?
Okay, so escalation of commitment in the last half century of research is the finding that when people are facing possible or likely failure, instead of rethinking their decisions, they tend to double down and invest more, and they end up throwing good money after bad. It sounds like a sunk cost problem, but the biggest drivers of escalation are not economic, they're emotional. It's about ego, identity, and image. So we've heard President Biden talk about how he's a fighter. He doesn't want to feel or look like a quitter. And I think that's potentially the wrong frame for this decision. Instead of thinking about it as a loss to withdraw, he should be thinking about it as an opportunity, not just to pass the torch, but to ignite the flame, to be a selfless steward for the next generation to rise.
But Adam, the complication is he's also surrounded by a whole group of people who may not walk away as winners. He could walk away as winner potentially, depending on how you think this is all perceived. But the team around him ultimately are not going to have a job, right? And they are not going to have the power that they once had. And so there's sort of this interesting sort of team dynamic, and those around them, I imagine, whispering in his ear as well. And I'm curious how you think they should be thinking about this.
Well, I would probably ask them to think about their own reasoning. We've heard from Team Biden over the last 4 years that they're upset with Republicans for putting their own jobs over what might be the right thing to do, and saying, look, we're going to back Trump because he has the base, and we want to stay in Congress. So this is a chance to reflect on: do you want to make the same mistake, or are you actually going to take the high road and risk your own job for the good of the country?
Adam, I don't know if you read, but Reid Hoffman put out a note last Friday, effectively saying, what Democrats need to rally around the current president, that actually Republicans, by the way, you were talking about loyalty, Joe, that Republicans, when there's a problem, they rally around their people. They don't walk from their people. That it's just a classic sort of Democrat thing to do, to sort of, drop one person and go to the next.
Stay in power, exactly.
No, not to stay in power. Not
for the party to stay in power.
Well, one way is
doesn't matter who the figurehead is, and how long has Joe Biden really been in charge anyway?
You really think that Republicans are rallying around their person so they don't stay in power just because they're loyal? We can have that debate a different day. Right. Adam, I just speak to the extent that there's a debate happening in the Democratic Party, and you do have people, donors like Reid Hoffman on one side, saying that the party needs to rally around him, and you have Reed Hastings on the other side saying that he needs to step away.
Well, look, I don't think this is a question of philosophy at this point. It's a question of strategy, right? The question is, who is the best candidate to rally behind? And my worry is that discussion is not getting the attention it deserves. I think there's a lot of discussion about polls right now. I think what we need are not pollsters, but forecasters. A group of experts, and there's a whole community of people who compete in tournaments to do this, to try to figure out what's likely to change in the next 4 months. And what's going to sway voters. And I think that too much is around, well, here's what Republicans do. And so Democrats need to follow that lead because it's effective. And there should be a much bigger emphasis on, well, what are the likely events between now and November that would ultimately affect probably the 7 swing states that will decide this election, and who's the candidate that's going to put the Democratic Party in the best position to end up on top.
So, Ed, have you met any pro-Trump professor? I mean, you got about half the country is backing him. Have you met a pro-Trump professor, either at Penn or elsewhere? Do you know any? And it's not correlated with the kind of stuff we saw a couple of months ago, is it? In terms of, a lot of the major Ivy Leagues didn't comport themselves very well during, after October 7th. Any correlation there?
I've interacted with quite a few professors who are planning to vote for Trump, and I do think that number has gone up since we saw the presidential testimonies in Congress and what was seen as an ineffective response to the tragedy and terrorist attack of October 7th.
Hope so.
But still a pretty small number from my interactions.
Okay. Adam Grant, we appreciate you joining us. I want to wish you a happy 4th. Thank you.
Next on Squawk Pod, Boeing up against a deadline with the Department of Justice. Go to trial over its role in deadly crashes and quality mishaps, or plead guilty. Former United Airlines CEO Oscar Munoz weighs in.
Fighting the U.S. government, don't ever think that's a really good idea because it lasts for so long. So again, depending on what the plea deal holds, if I were a betting man, I'd go 50.005% in favor of that. There's going to be a plea deal.
We'll be right back. You're listening to Squawk Pod from CNBC. Today with Joe Kernan and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Today marking Boeing's deadline to either plead guilty to a felony fraud charge or go to trial against the Justice Department stemming from its door panel blowout and subsequent quality control issues. Joining us right now is Oscar Munoz. He's former United Airlines chairman and CEO and, of course, now a CNBC contributor. Oscar, I'm putting you in charge of Boeing. You get to make the decision. What do you do?
Well, that's a nice hypothetical. Good morning and happy day after 4th. That is a hypothetical that I don't think anybody wants to be part of, for sure. What a difficult situation for them. Do you, on one hand, put it behind you, right? Go ahead and plead guilty, work the plea deal, pay the fines, and then move forward. Or, take a chance on a very high-profile, court case. It's going to last forever and will continue to drag your brand through the mud. And, of course, you're looking for a CEO. You're looking for your customers to regain their trust. And the whole combination of issues is a really daunting one. And I am not a lawyer, so I can't advise on that. But facing that decision is clearly a difficult one. And if I'm in charge, I don't know. I don't know what I do. I don't know. I don't have all the details.
Well, so Oscar, here's my question. What do you think the brand damage is to pleading guilty? What does it do? I don't know. Contractually, are there the equivalent of like key man provisions in any contracts with different airlines or others that say, okay, if you are a convicted felon, though I know it's a corporate felon, that somehow could undo deals or other things that have been made in the past?
Yeah, there's a host of downstream effects. Clearly, the brand imagery, like everything else, the news cycle is what it is, and that thing fades. You'll always be referred to as the convicted. You'll have all those references, but you can get on with life, and depending on the conditions, you can somewhat manage. The conditions aren't great. You have people in your offices for a long period of time. You have a lot of scrutiny with regards to your continued government contracts. But all of those are somewhat manageable. It is the same things you're going to face if you're convicted. And so there's a roll of the dice. It's like if the same things are going to happen if I get convicted or not, do I just go ahead and go through with a very expensive trial? So again, it is very, very complicated a decision to make.
Things definitely, after the initial two accidents, they were very, just killed a lot of people, bad. The worst thing that can happen. So you get on probation where you know that you're going to be watched very closely and you need to comply with whatever it is, somewhat stringent safety regulations. So when you see what happened with those bolts that they weren't even put on, and it just seems like you don't really need to know a whole lot else to see that you could make that stick in a trial, don't you think, Oscar? How does something like that happen? And there's other things too. That's not the only one. But that's the most flagrant thing that shows that they did not take the safety protocols seriously.
Again, none of us are attorneys, I don't believe. Anything can happen in a court case. Facts can get presented in very different ways. Your particular example of the bolts, there could be a host of different situations that are specific to that plant, to that facility, to that time slot of the people that were working. That could be seen that it's an isolated item. Everyone is not a wholesale culture. Yes, and then you bring in all the other things and the hundreds of whistleblowers that are showing up. So clearly the facts are not with you. But again, none of us on this call or even listening are privy to all of the information that's there. And we all just see the headlines, which tend to be sensational. So I don't know those facts. And if you're comfortable with those facts, then you go ahead and go for the court case. But I don't know. fighting the U.S. government, don't ever think that's a really good idea because it lasts for so long. So again, depending on what the plea deal holds, if I were a betting man, I'd go 50.005% in favor of that. There's going to be a plea deal. Now that one will also have to be approved by people, and unless it's really a tough plea, there's going to be a lot of pushback, certainly from the affected families, for lack of, for a very specific case. So even going the plea deal route is not an easy one, and it'll be fraught with more issues in the near future.
Yeah, Oscar, separate question just on the airline industry for the summer right now. It appears that there's been enough capacity put on, or maybe you could argue maybe too much capacity, insofar as prices are down marginally in terms of where we are right now. Do you think they're going to go down further? What's your take on where we stand just from a capacity perspective?
It depends. It's so weird to be able to talk about pricing now that I'm not part of the industry specifically. But you're right. I mean, prices right now domestically tend to be, it depends on where you're going, like anything else. Right. Europe and far off places are down because there's a huge amount of demand and plenty of capacity. But comparatively speaking to other times, it is down. So it's hard to tell. It is all such competition.
And then finally, what do you make of the competition now? And Delta's just sort of thrown down a new gauntlet. You probably saw last week or a week and a half ago now. This new Delta One lounge at JFK. They're spending a lot of money to put these now in LA, New York. I think they're going to put them in some other places as well. United is either going to try to catch up or says it's trying to catch up in this sort of super premium space. Does that make sense to you? Can you make the math work? What do you think?
Well, and I have flown Delta One, and I have flown, of course, Global Service, and the clubs themselves have just improved mightily. You see this across the board. I haven't seen a lot of American airline new clubs, but both Deltas and Uniteds are just spectacular. The ones that are being rebuilt, for sure. The Delta One experience with the, you have a security function that gets you into this club. Once you get into that main club, when you have to get to your gate, it's still kind of far away. And so, yes, all of that makes a difference. It's very special. You get into a special door. Global Service has that same for United. So they're kind of equal in that regard, but that's a biased statement. Here's the big issue. You still have to fly the darn airline appropriately. My Delta One experience was great until I got to the flight, which was delayed by over an hour and a half, which happens to everyone or some. But
do you think the lock-in effect is real? Meaning people are not sitting on kayak trying to choose the lowest fare or the fare that or the scheduled flight that makes the most sense?
Yeah, no, this industry is always, it's not as sticky as you think. It's sticky if you're a frequent flyer in a particular location, meaning out of Houston or Chicago or any of the United hubs or Atlanta for Delta. You're going to be beholden to that airline because that's where you can get to the most places at the most time, to your point on schedule. And so you're beholden to them in that regard. So that has a hold. Broader, like LA is a market that's very widely, the shares widely distributed. So I think it does make a difference there. But again, it all depends on where you're going and when you can get back. If you're going from LA to Boston, which I was doing, it was the only way I could really fly that day to get there. So I chose them. But I can see how both Global Service and One, and I suspect Concierge Key, whatever American flies, is an important one. And it's, by the way, on a tangential note, something that even someone like a Southwest is going to have to consider because, to your point of stickiness, customers are actually liking and wanting more of this for their things. So it does have an effect for sure. Otherwise, nobody would do it.
Oscar Munoz, we appreciate your perspective on all of this. We want to wish you a happy July 4th, and we will see what Boeing ultimately decides to do or not later this afternoon.
That's Squawk Pod for today and this holiday week. Thank you for listening. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. You can tune in weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern, or get the very best of our TV show right into your ears when you follow Squawk Pod wherever you get your podcasts. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider rating Squawk Pod or writing a brief review. That helps other listeners find us. That's it. Have a great weekend, and we'll meet you back here on Monday.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.